Good afternoon. On behalf of the Family Research Council, welcome to today's lecture with our guest, Joe Carter. My name is Rob Schwarzwalder. I have the privilege of serving as Senior Vice President here at FRC. During the First World War, said the anti-fascist politician Gaetano Salvemini, with a name like Schwarzwalder, I'm particularly concerned with saying names like that correctly, we used to say that the situation in Germany was serious but not desperate. In Austria, desperate but not serious, and in Italy, desperate but normal. Those of us concerned about religious liberty in America tend to have similar attitudes. Many are cautiously optimistic and contend that while threats to religious freedom are serious, the situation is not desperate. Others consider themselves to be realistically pessimistic, believing that the issue is desperate but what we should consider normal in our secular society. Joe Carter argues that Christians should take the Austrian approach. The state of religious liberty in America is desperate but not serious. Joe will explain to us today why we don't have the luxury of being conscientious objectors in this latest front of the culture wars, and provides practical suggestions for how we can carry out the task of defending and protecting religious liberty in America. Joe Carter is one of the most creative voices in evangelical commentary today. He is communications specialist for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, an editor for the Gospel Coalition, a senior editor at the Acton Institute, an adjunct professor of journalism at Patrick Henry College, and a stunt double for Henry Cavill in the new Superman movie. Most of those are true. Joe is also a former FRCer. He worked here for a number of years as editor of online publications, or online media, I think, and we're glad to have you back home here at FRC, Joe. In addition, I should mention Joe is also an author. He's written How to Argue Like Jesus, Learning Persuasion from History's Greatest Communicator, and the author of the forthcoming NIV Life Hacks Bible, Practical Tools for Successful Spiritual Habits. So Joe, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Glad to have you here.
Well, as Rob mentioned in the introduction there, an Italian politician named Gaetano Salvemini said that during the First World War, we used to say that the situation in Germany was serious but not desperate. In Austria, desperate but not serious. And in Italy, desperate but normal. And those of us concerned about religious liberty in America tend to have similar attitudes. Many of us are cautiously optimistic and contend that while threats to religious liberty are serious, the situation is not desperate. Others consider themselves to be realistically pessimistic, believing this situation is desperate but what we consider normal in our secular society. My own view is that we should take the Austrian approach, that the state of religious liberty in America is desperate but not serious. Let's consider why it's desperate, and I want to particularly focus on why it's desperate for Christians. This is not to underplay the situation for Muslims or Jews or any other religious group, but I think Christians have a different approach to religious liberty. We have different reasons for supporting religious liberty, and we have things that kind of make it unique. So I want to focus on why in particular, focus on them. And I think the current threats are in some ways more desperate than they ever were in our history, especially for the broad-based Christian community. So if current trends prevail, the religious liberties of Americans will soon be limited to 3 H's of freedom to worship. We'll be allowed to worship however we want in our heads, in our homes, and our houses of worship. We'll be forbidden, though, from bringing anything into the public square. And the freedom of worship is kind of the stunted view of religious liberty is kind of accepted now in America. And this is one of the reasons why it's become so desperate, because a lot of people still believe that we still have religious freedom because we still retain the freedom of worship. But let's consider why it's not serious. That is why it should not be we should not be apprehensive or fatalistic about the future of religious liberty. And the reason is because we have the good news. We have the gospel of Jesus Christ. God's kingdom has entered history. The process of renewal of the whole world has now begun, and it's inevitable and irreversible. No matter what happens, we know the ultimate victory belongs to Jesus. And it's important to keep this in mind before we get too focused on the short-term wins and losses. If you look at for example, at military history, you'll find that individual battles don't always mean that much. For example, out of the 240 battles in the American Revolution, the Patriots won fewer than 100. They won fewer than 40% of the battles and still won the war. And that's something we need to keep in mind. Even though we know the victory is assured, we're going to lose a lot of the battles on the way, especially on the religious liberty front. We should never be pessimistic, knowing that we are assured of this ultimate victory. That's why we can take a clear-eyed assessment of the threats to religious liberty, conclude that the system that is desperate, and yet because our Lord reigns, we can stop the deterioration. So if the victory is assured, why bother to fight for religious liberty at all? Why bother with individual battles and skirmishes if they don't affect the outcome? The reason is because there's a real tension that rises from the mystery of the already and the not yet kingdom. The kingdom of God is present and yet not fully present. Because of our job as Christians is to proclaim the good news of Christ. And this is the primary reason we are defenders of religious liberty, especially our own religious liberty. As Hugh Hewitt says in his book, In But Not Of, quote, "The effective and mass communication of the gospel depends on the freedom to proclaim it. Though it is possible to proclaim the gospel in the face of persecution, the unfettered freedom to do so is much, much to be preferred. There are billions of souls who are up for eternal grabs, so the unfettered ability to reach them with good news is a great and wonderful thing, hard to create and difficult to defend," end quote. Religious liberty is indeed hard to create and difficult to defend. That is why many of us would prefer to remain conscientious objectors in this latest front of the cultural war. But we don't have that luxury. We have been called to live and serve in a time and place when defending and protecting religious liberty is the duty of all believers. While we might not have all the same role to play, I believe each of us is called to take at least one of the following tasks. We're either called, and some of us called to take on multiple tasks at one time. We're called to identify and predict future threats related to religious liberty. We're called to work to roll back current restrictions on religious liberty. We're called to prevent further restrictions on religious liberty. And we're called to protect and defend those who are currently or will soon face persecution or affected by such restrictions. Now let's briefly consider how we can carry out these tasks over the next 20 to 25 years. Now, a quarter of a century, especially for a lot of the young people here, is a long time in their life. But if we look at the lifespan of the church, it's but a fleeting moment. But it's just enough to see how the impending threats on the horizon and time enough to do something about them. But this requires that we act now. And that's why it's imperative that we be able to recognize and identify the threats that are coming. Now, I want to spend the bulk of my talk considering how we can identify these future threats. So let's start by considering how we can predict the future. In an interview on the Science and Science Fiction, the novelist William Gibson said, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." And what Gibson meant was that innovation in science fiction could hardly be found, at least in its embryonic form, in our current ideas or terminology and technology. Much the same could be said about future societal and legal norms related to religious liberty. The threats are already here, they're just not evenly distributed yet. When I worked for FRC almost 10 years ago, most of our main focuses at the time were threats posed by religious liberty by same-sex marriage. At the time, even some of our friends and allies thought we were engaged in hyperbole, if not outright fear-mongering. It seemed implausible that same-sex marriage would take over the whole country within the next decade, much less that it would be a threat to religious liberty. But Tony Perkins and the other leaders at FRC were right. It's not that they were prophetic. They were merely looking at what was already happening in states like Massachusetts and warning that it would soon happen across the United States. And unfortunately, many of FRC's predictions from that time did come true. But the future ahead of us is not causally closed. If we can identify the threats that are already here, we can work to prevent them before they become evenly distributed throughout society. And one of the first ways we can do that is to be aware of the future will come faster than it has in the past. Now consider how over the past 50 years, the rate of technological change and adoption has increased at an astounding rate. It took 46 years for electricity and 35 years for the telephone to be adopted by a quarter of Americans. But it took only 13 years for the cell phone and 7 years for the internet to reach the same levels within the population. Ideas and concepts are also being adopted by society more quickly. Ideas that once seemed radical have gone from implausible to normal within less than a decade. The prime example, and one of the most significant threats to religious liberty, is increasing acceptance of same-sex marriage. In 1996, 65% of Americans were opposed to same-sex marriage. In 2015, 61% supported same-sex marriage. In May 2003, no states had yet approved homosexual unions. 10 years later, 1/5 of the states allowed people to marry someone of the same sex. Just 2 years after that, same-sex marriage was legal in all 50 states. How was this agenda to redefine marriage able to advance the level of public policy? And how did it happen so quickly? To understand the seismic cultural shift, we need to look at an obscure 2-decade-old political theory. Now, in the mid-1990s, a political scientist named Joseph Overton developed the concept of the Overton Window. And Overton describes a window in the range of public reaction to ideas in public discourse. Overton believed that the spectrum included all possible ranges of a window of opportunity. It's like if you stand on a yardstick on one end, on either end are the extreme policy actions for a political issue. Between the ends lie all the gradations of policy from one extreme to the other. And the yardstick represents the full spectrum for a particular issue. Now, the essence of the Overton window is that only a portion of this policy spectrum is within the realm of the politically possible at any time. It doesn't just jump from one end to the other. It goes along these gradations. And regardless of how vigorously an activist group may campaign, only policy initiatives within the window of the politically possible will be met with success. And that's why it's key that sometimes we need to keep these areas within the area they already are. Now, all issues fall somewhere along the policy continuum, which can be roughly outlined as inconceivable, radical, acceptable, popular, and policy. When the window moves or expands, ideas become more or less politically and culturally acceptable. Overton's model was developed to explain adjustments in the political climate, but I think it can also help us identify and classify the progress of various threats to religious liberty. Here, for example, is how a key threat to religious liberty, the demonization of Christians opposed to same-sex marriage, transition in 4 steps from inconceivable to policy. Now, the first step from inconceivable to radical requires having a person or group with some level of authority or legitimacy express a viewpoint that is once relegated to the political or cultural fringe. Now, we call this the perverse and professors stage, because whatever perversions of moral norms occur in society, to be mainstream, they have to go through academia first. They have to have a symposium on pedophilia before pedophilia is going to be accepted. There has to be acceptance in academia of certain ideas that seemed outrageous at the time, but because they're discussing them in academia, they're becoming intellectually respectable. The politics of the bedroom and the classroom inevitably overlap, and what was once considered almost unthinkable is now considered merely radical. Consider, for example, the idea that Christians who refuse to use their artistic talents, such as photographers or bakers, for same-sex wedding celebrations would be considered bigots, the moral equivalent of the racial segregationists of the 1950s and 60s. And just a decade ago, back in 2006, back when I was working here at FRC, many religious supporters of same-sex marriage considered this comparison to be, as Catholic law professor Doug Kmek said, inconceivable. Kmek claimed that it would be inconceivable that, quote, a successful analogy will be drawn in the public mind between irrational and morally repugnant racial discrimination and the rational, and at least morally debatable, differentiation of traditional and same-sex marriage, end quote. But in reality, the shift from inconceivable to radical had occurred a long time ago, back about 1987. In an article for Guide magazine, a pair of Harvard-educated homosexual rights activists, Marshall Kirk and Hunter Batson, wrote an article called The Overhauling of Straight America. The two later expanded the argument outlined for a homosexual normalization into a book called After the Ball. That book was published by one of the largest publishing houses in America, Doubleday, and became a national bestseller. In their essay and in the book, they proposed the radical idea not only of portraying Christians as bigots, but also of using churches to carry out that mission. They write, and I quote, when conservative churches condemn gays, there are only 2 things that can be done to confound the homophobia of true believers. First, we can use talk to muddy the moral waters. This means publicizing support for gays by more moderate churches, raising theological objections to our own about conservative interpretations of biblical teachings, and exposing hate and inconsistency, end quote. Of course, this tactic is forced today, as we see in denominations like the Episcopal Church, who openly embrace same-sex marriage, and revisionists such as the self-described evangelical Matthew Vines, who write books challenging the traditional interpretation of same-sex or biblical sexual ethics so that it can be more inclusive of certain homosexual relationships. But that's only the first part. Kirk and Mattson add that the next homosexual activist, quote, can undermine the moral authority of homophobic churches by portraying them as antiquated backwaters, badly out of step with the times and with the latest findings of psychology. Against the mighty pull of institutional religion, one must set the mightier draw of science and public opinion. Such an unholy alliance has worked well against churches before on such topics as divorce and abortion. With enough open talk about the prevalence and acceptability of homosexuality, that alliance can work again here, end quote. And keep in mind, he's talking about how to move the church, not just move the public and society. So that's how we go from Doug Kmek's inconceivable to the idea that Christians are bigots for for opposing same-sex marriage became just a merely radical idea. And the second step is from radical to acceptable. Missing a slide here. The second step from radical to acceptable includes redefinition or reconceptualization of a concept and the use of invective against those who refuse to accept the shift. For instance, the term marriage has been redefined to mean the state-sponsored copulation of any two, or possibly more, adults who want to share a bed and a tax form. Those who reject this shift from radical to acceptable are shamed into approving the new redefining of terms and institutions by the deployment of a stingingly suitable insult, in this case, bigot. The application of the word bigot has become more effective than a billy club at beating people into submission. The insult is particularly effective when it comes from our own fellow Christians. When the Kansas legislature passed a bill in 2014 protecting the religious freedom of businesses and individuals to refuse services to same-sex couples, Kristen Powers, a columnist for USA Today and a contributor to Fox News, wrote that, quote, Christians backing this bill are essentially arguing for homosexual Jim Crow laws, end quote. For far too many Americans, including many Christians, there are a few core beliefs that they won't change to avoid being called a bigot. This disapproval of their creator is unfortunate, enduring the disfavor of their peers is unimaginable. The third step, from acceptable to popular, merely requires personalizing the issue. In this particular case, the perception is created that the only reason the Christian would oppose homosexual behavior is not because of the clear teaching of Scripture, but because of a lack of exposure to the LGBT community. A prime example of this, the Christian ethicist David P. Gushee used an excuse not only to explain his own shift on the issue, but also to argue that the church should change too. Gushee says, quote, it is hard to describe exactly why my moral vision shifted in this way, but undoubtedly it had much to do with my move to Atlanta in 2007 and my growing contact with LGBT people, especially fellow Christians. I hardly knew anyone who was gay before that move, but afterward, they seemed to be everywhere, and a few became very dear friends. It became clear to me, in a deeply spiritual place that I will allow no one to challenge, that God was sending LGBT people to me. The fact that one of these LGBT Christians is my dear younger sister, Katie, has made this issue even more deeply personal for me than it would have been. The fact that one place where she developed a deep struggle with the sexuality was in evangelical churches has contributed to my new moral commitment to make evangelical families and churches safe places for LGBT people, end quote. And what Gushee means here by safe spaces, of course, safe places, is that the churches will abandon the biblical teaching on sexual ethics and homosexuality in favor of something that's more fitting to secular society and will be more welcomed by those who already believe this. And notice it's the same strategy Gushee's adopting is the one adopted by Kirk and Madison in 1986. That they will publicize support for gay Christians, gays by more moderate churches. And that's what we've seen, especially in the last few years. Now, when Christians offer alternative interpretation of sexual ethics is both possible and preferred, then any religious objections will be deemed as rooted in animus and not a matter of Christian conscience. And we saw this too in the Supreme Court case of Oberfeld, where I believe is Justice Kennedy said that animus was the only reason that could be motivating opposition to same-sex marriage. Now, the next step is from popular to policy. A policy preference protected by law tends to happen rather rapidly. In some cases, though, policy doesn't catch up until the popular fur is firmly embedded in culture. And consider the debates in recent years over the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRAs. The federal RFA is a law that passed in 1993 to prevent other federal laws from substantially burdening a person's free exercise of religion. The legislation was introduced by New York's Democratic Congressman Chuck Schumer and was passed by a unanimous U.S. Senate and a near-unanimous U.S. unanimous U.S. House, and only 3 people didn't vote for it in the Senate. The bill was then signed into law by Bill Clinton, who said it was one of the greatest achievements of his presidency. The federal RFA was intended to apply to all branches of government, both the federal and state law, but in 1997, in the case of City of Bern versus Flores, the Supreme Court ruled the RFRA exceeded the federal power when applied to state laws. In response to this ruling, many individual states passed their own state-level RFRAs so that they could apply to state governments and local municipalities. As of 2015, we have 20 states that have RFRAs, and 10 others have religious liberty protections that state courts have interpreted provide the similar level of protection. And with some exceptions, such as Mississippi, these states versions are almost exactly the same as the federal version that Bill Clinton passed and signed into law. Now, none of these RFRAs even mention homosexuals, nor are they about discrimination at all. Yet when new RFA legislation was introduced in 2014 and 2015, many media outlets identified the bills as anti-gay. Unfortunately, rather than being outraged at finding they were lied to by politicians and journalists, most Americans never bothered even to learn the truth about what was in these bills. Even Christians were duped into believing these were laws that moral people should oppose. Neither federal nor state RFRAs have ever protected a business that chose to discriminate against homosexuals. These laws have also never been used to protect a Christian who has appealed to his religious conscience in refusing to serve same-sex weddings. But the perception that the laws have the potential to be used in this way has led to more broad-based opposition to legislation that protects religious freedom in general. In retrospect, it's easy to connect the dots and see how same-sex marriage led to opposition of religious liberty. But while the Overton Window is a useful tool for allowing us to gauge how current threats to religious liberty have developed and how to explain them to others, what is most useful in helping us identify and predict future threats. Now, once we've identified the potential threats in whatever stage of the Overton Window they happen to be in, we must then work to roll back current restrictions and prevent new ones. I'm not going to say much today about how we can go about rolling back the current restrictions. There are a lot of groups and individuals working on this already, such as FRC, Alliance Defending Freedom, the Beckett Fund, and so on. And they don't need any more advice. What they need is our support. So seek them out and find ways you can help them be more effective. What I do want to focus on, though, is how we can prevent further restrictions on religious freedom, particularly how we can involve the average person who is not likely to give much attention, energy, or time to this issue. And this is the majority of people, even in our churches, who they might care about it, but they're not going to make it a key issue in their life. Fortunately, we don't necessarily need Christians to march in the streets. We don't need our brothers and sisters in Christ to refuse to take. We only need them to refuse to take the next step in the path to destruction. And what we need from them is what I would call convictional inaction. As it relates to religious freedom, convictional inaction is the mere refusal to side with the forces of anti-liberty. For example, if every Christian in America who truly believed or truly cared about religious liberty would simply refuse to vote for any candidate, regardless of political party, who opposed laws protecting religious freedom, such restrictions would end into political cycles. The politicians could not stand for people who would not vote for them. That's a nonpartisan approach that applies convictional inaction to solve the problem by literally doing nothing. Similarly, if every Christian in America simply refused to condone the redefinition of marriage, we wouldn't have Christians threatened by fines and bankruptcy for following their theologically informed consciences. If that sort of committed convictional inaction had already been in place back in 2006 when the FRC was talking about this, we wouldn't be in this position we are today. When properly applied, large-scale convictional inaction is one of the most powerful tools at our disposal. Such convictional inaction, though, often requires as much courage as conviction. Unfortunately, for the past several decades, America has produced an overwhelming number of Christians who are adept at explaining why they can support almost any issue that is antithetical to Christianity, and depressingly few who can give reasons we should adhere to the teachings of Scripture and the wisdom of the church. This is especially true when it comes to religious freedom. We just lack the basic education on these issues to explain it to ourselves, to our congregations, much less the secular society. And to roll back these current restrictions on conscience, we need to educate our fellow believers. We need to explain to them why religious freedom is important and why it's important for advancing the gospel. And we also need to explain why it's important to defend religious freedom for all faiths, not just our own. In addition, we need to draw clear lines of distinction between what is and is not allowed legitimately by Scripture and encourage others to stand for the truth. Errant theology about Christian ethics inevitably leads to erosion of religious conscience and inevitably leads to loss of religious liberty. But we also need to make the issue and arguments more personal. As we saw with David Gushie's use of his sister, once you make the issue personal, it becomes more effective. We often provide examples by some whose mere exposure to homosexuals or transgendered individuals changes their ideas about how those people, how their deeply held religious beliefs should affect their views on these issues. And because it's been so effective on the other side, we should consider using it for our purposes too. Rather than making abstract claims about how a hypothetical person may be affected by an issue, we need to provide flesh and blood exhibits to show them how the harm is being done. A particular effective example, recent example, has been Barronelle Stutzman, a grandmother and longtime florist, who was sued by the state of Washington for acting consistent with her Christian belief. Barronelle referred a longstanding customer, who she considered a friend, to a nearby florist because she could not in good conscience create custom arrangements for their same-sex wedding. The ruling by the state prevents Barronelle's case from even going to trial and makes her personally liable for any damages and attorney fees incurred by the same-sex couple or by the state of Washington. Everything she's worked to build, everything she's done in her life, including her home, her family, her business, her life savings are now at risk because of this refusal and her decision to stand with her conscience. Now, Stutzman's gentle demeanor and commitment to following Christ while serving others helped many Americans to better grasp why it was wrong to force her to violate her conscience. She is a model of how to personalize the slippery slope by putting a human face on the cause. To prevent further decline of religious freedom, we need to learn how to argue it more effectively by learning to argue more personally. Stutzman's example also shows why it is imperative that we need to find ways to protect those whose religious liberty have been violated. Stutzman is incredibly brave and expressed a willingness to face the consequences of her convictions. She has also been fortunate to receive financial support by many outraged by the injustice done to her. Because she is one of the first to stand, Stutzman has been the recipient of much generosity from the Christians and from others. But Stutzman was the first. What will happen to the 4th, the 40th, the 400th person who this is affected by? Will we be there for them too? What happens to the professor who loses tenure because he's professing his faith? What happens to the minister who refuses to hold a same-sex marriage in his church? We can only expect people to stand firm when the church is standing with them. Individual acts of courage need to be backstopped by the communal support of the church. The time to act on this is now, before the problem grows too large. We need to begin putting systems and programs in place that will help those who will be affected by these restrictions in the near future. Some believers will need financial support to pay for the government fines. Others will need help finding a job when they are fired for holding firm to their beliefs. And in the future, we may even have brothers and sisters who need help taking care of their children because they're in jail for refusing to put Caesar ahead of Jesus Christ. The ideas that Christians may soon be jailed for the faith may sound absurd. It sounds like a scare tactic used on direct mail to solicit funding from donors. And it's true that persecution is used too loosely in America. At a time when Christians are being killed for their faith in the Middle East, it's absurd for believers in the U.S. to claim that they are being persecuted when somebody says Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas. But if we are taking an honest assessment of the state of religious freedom in America, we must admit that persecution in the future is at least a possibility. We're on a trajectory where persecution of faithful believers could be rather common by the end of the century. In remarking on the problem of faith in our secular world, the Catholic priest Cardinal Francis George said, quote, "I expect to die in my bed. My successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square." End quote. In April 2014, Cardinal George died in his bed. Like George, I expect his successor, as well as many Baptist, Lutherans, and Presbyterian ministers, will also die in prison. Where I disagree is with the timeline on which generation of successor the persecution will fall. I think it's a long time in the future because I think we have plenty of time to act. I believe we still have time before George's predictions come true. We even have time to prevent the outcome. The situation is indeed desperate, but we can prevent it from becoming serious. Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for any questions. Anybody?
Since you're very familiar with the technological side of things, where do you see our biggest potential threat to religious liberty on the internet side of things, as far as, corporately owned websites like Facebook, or not just websites, but platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Google? I know Eric Schmidt just made a comment recently about Google being putting in algorithms to filter hate speech out of its search engines, which that could easily be extrapolated over to any kind of religious speech. So where do you see among our biggest threats to religious liberty among in the technological world, and will anybody even hear about it if our freedoms in that area were removed?
That's a great question. I think because so many of these large corporations are handled by board directors who oppose our beliefs, that because of that, they have a lot more control over the communication. The communication tools we have now. We used to complain because the media liberals controlled the media. They can keep us from saying what we needed to say. And then we thought, with the rise of social media, well, we kind of leveled the playing field. And now we have the tools to do that. But now, as we're seeing now, those tools can be taken away from us. And it won't. And we kind of focus right now on the individual privacy issues or freedom of speech issues. But what's going to happen in the future is, like, as Jared said, that it's going to get to the point where our message isn't even seen by anybody. We can't even get our message out there because the algorithms are blocking it from the beginning. And I think this is one of these issues we need to have, especially our more technology-minded Christians, to kind of be pushing forward and fighting for this. And maybe even creating alternatives that we can have alternative platforms so that when Facebook blocks us out, we can have somewhere else to go. Now, maybe not be as effective as Facebook, but if we can muster some outrage now before it gets to that point, I think we can do a lot to prevent it. I think we still have a lot of power over Twitter and Facebook and some of these, but if we wait too long, I think we're going to lose the advantage we may have to do something.
Joe, I'm intrigued by your last comment about finding alternative sources, and I think I agree with that. I'm concerned that we not abandon places that are in the mainstream. And I'm wondering your thoughts about having committed Christians with a Christian worldview entering the major electronic and print media and essentially taking a stand and saying, I'm not here to propagandize, but I am going to fight for fairness, and I am not going to accede to a predominant cultural milieu that militates against Christian faith. Do you see wisdom in that? Is that a fruitless attempt? What do you think?
That's a great point. I think recently my friend Rod Dreher's proposal of Benedict adoption, where Christians kind of withdraw back into their own communities, kind of regroup. I think that has some merit, but I think overall, I think we saw as evangelicals, we know how that worked out when the fundamentalist movement kind of withdrew, and we lost kind of the effect on culture and society. So I don't think withdrawal is effective. I don't think creating our own little ghettos that we go talk to each other in is going to be effective. I'm also kind of skeptical about the idea that we're going to put people in place, kind of the James David Hunter approach that institutions matter, therefore we need to kind of put people in the institutions. As we saw in the academia, a lot of people, once they get in there, they have great intentions when they go, but once they get in there, they're so worried about their own career, they just stop. They don't speak out in again. I mean, how many people do you know that went into academia to be a Christian voice, and once they get there, they're like, well, when I get tenure, I will speak up. And when you get tenure, well, I got tenure, I don't want to lose my tenure by speaking out. And so what happens is we have a whole group that are already infiltrated, but they're afraid to say anything, and they're afraid to help those who are coming after them that they could be. So I think to be effective, I think we need to get on these boards, the board of Google, the board of Apple, the board of all these things. And that's going to be a lot harder than just, being a programmer and working your way up. So I don't think there's an easy solution there. I think it's a long-term problem that, but of course, as Christians, we have the benefit of evangelization, that all we have to do is turn somebody's mind. And one of a good example is Peter Thiel. I'm not sure how much Peter Thiel aligns with a lot of issues, but he's more receptive to the Christian ideas than some other people in Silicon Valley. So I think by making connections on the personal level, we can kind of have an influence in the long term. Yeah. Oh, yes.
What do you think of the fact that the woman you mentioned is under oppression for not being a florist for that gay couple, whereas there was that story recently of a Muslim truck driver who was awarded money because he refused to transport alcohol?
Yeah, that's a good point. Does seem to be kind of a double standard there when Muslims defend their faith to support their religious freedom. The secular community doesn't have the same reaction to it. And I think the reason why is because Muslims make up such a small part of the population. I think they're only about 3 million, maybe 1% of the population. So it's kind of, I mean, that's why a lot of when the Religious Freedom Restoration Act came about in 1993, the issue at the time was the use of Native Americans using peyote. And at the time, people were like, well, who cares if there's one little group who's maybe a couple thousand people? Why not do something to protect their religious freedoms? And then when it was realized, wait a minute, these laws affect Christians too, and these Christians could have an effect on secular society, then they was like, well, we don't support these laws anymore. So I think that's the situation we're seeing there, that there's an open double standard where because Christians, there's so many, there's still a majority of America, that there's a fear that if we allow Christians to have too much freedom in this religious freedom, it will turn back the advances they made, especially within the sexual revolution. So I think we shouldn't be surprised when we see those double standards. I think we're going to see more of that in the future. Except though I think we are going to start to see more Muslims and Orthodox Jews because if they start speaking out on sexuality issues, they're going to start seeing the same pushback as Christians are seeing.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me here. Appreciate it.